Hello, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started with our webinar. Thank you for joining us for Questioning Teacher Students to Ask Questions webinar. I am India, your moderator. We're excited to have Lucy Canotis, who is the Director of Elementary Curriculum in the Timberland Regional School District. She is a former teacher who used the QFT in her classroom to shift instruction to more student-centered and a trainer of the question formulation technique for the Right Question Institute. We also have Karen Matzo, who is the Director of Professional Development, who will be helping Lucy today. But before we start today, let's go over a few logistics. This webinar is recorded. There's also a control panel that you may see where you can ask questions and raise your hands. Everyone is currently muted. So once you raise your hand and have a question, I can unmute you. And we really enjoy lots of questions, so feel free to ask anything if you're confused. And at the end of this webinar, we will open up the floor for any last questions before we end it. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and have Lucy take it away.
Can I interrupt? It's Karen Matzo.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to add one thing and explain one thing, if that's okay. On the chat, on your control panel, there's a place for questions. So in addition to having us unmute you to ask questions, it's super easy to just write in the questions section. And both India and I will be monitoring those questions as we move through the webinar, and we'll be interrupting Lucy as she goes to pose those questions to her. And then Lucy, if you could just go forward to 2 slides, I think. So there's India, there's me and Lucy, and one more.
This way. Nope.
To the directions, yes. So what I wanted to tell you is that this webinar is recorded, so you should feel free to use it going forward and share it and encourage your colleagues to view it too if you feel like it's something worth sharing. And I wanted to just tell you a little bit about that process. So if you go to our website, which is demonstratedsuccess.com, and you choose the member login option, it's at the top on the right-hand side, and they'll prompt you, this is step 3 on the bottom, to create a password and a user ID. And then you're going to join the consortium. Now, this webinar will sit in 2 different places in our resources. If you're a consortium member, like a 2018-19 consortium member, i.e., we're working with your school right now as part of a contract over the course of this year, you're all set, and you should be part of the 2018-19 consortium, and you'll find this webinar there. If you're a CSI school and you are joining us for the first time, then you are going to join a consortium called CSI Schools, all right? And there's a code, which is right down there, which says CSI Schools. And it's capital and lowercase dependent, all right? And you can, once you join that consortium, you can find this webinar recorded. If you're none of the above, we are also going to put this webinar on our public site. So you'll still have to go in and you'll have to create a member login, but we do have a public site where you will see that you can access the webinar. All right, so that's that. And if you have any other questions, just write them in, and Lucy will stop and we will interrupt her, and we love questions. Lucy and India, do you have anything you want to add?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Okay, you're all set?
Ready?
All right.
Okay.
Yep, I'm back on. Okay, so welcome all to the webinar. As India stated, I am Lucy Canotis, Director of Elementary Curriculum for the Timberland Regional School District. But more importantly right now, I'm a devotee to the question formulation technique. I'm excited to share this process with you today, one that I often used in my classroom to provide a deliberate way to help students cultivate a skill that is fundamentally important to their learning and engagement. So we're going to jump in and get started. The question formulation technique is a process that engages students in 3 types of thinking. First, utilizing divergent thinking. Secondly, moving to some convergent thinking, and then really thinking about their own thinking through that metacognition. Through that, students produce, improve, and strategize about questioning and their own questions. So the Right Question Institute are the founders of this technique, and they feel that this is a simple foundational technique that can be used in any content area and for multiple reasons. So we're going to jump into that today. We're going to practice together, and we're going to start by a little disclaimer. Typically, this is done with people sitting at a table together working on one chart paper. So we're going to get really creative and try to use the chat feature of your bar over here on the right hand side. So if you can click on the arrow down for next to chat and make sure that where it says to, you have all entire audience. That way everyone can see your questions. All right. Here are the rules for the procedure. I'm going to tell you the rules first. It's important to start with the rules first. Number 1 is to ask as many questions as you can. When in a group, you would be hearing the others asking questions, so feel free to look at the chat and kind of read along, but don't let that slow your own thinking down as you're listing questions. Just keep plugging in any question that comes to your mind as soon as it does. Obviously, you won't be engaging in step number 2, although as you're going over rules with your class, rule number 2 is really important. So this allows for divergent thinking to just flow. Students are not stopping to discuss any of the questions thrown out. They shouldn't be judging any of the questions, and they should not be answering any of the questions. We won't have that today. All right, so let's see. Number 3, there isn't a scribe. Typically, as I said, this is done in a group and one person would scribe all the questions. So we won't need to be thinking about number 3. But one thing to note here that I always tell the kids is that if I have a question that's very similar to one that's already written, it doesn't matter. Just go ahead and add that to the list. And number 4, we're making sure to change any statements into questions. Okay. Questions about the rules. Go ahead and type in if you do, or Karen, can we raise hands in this?
Sure. People can raise hands.
Okay. All right, so if we don't have any questions about the rules of the process or about how to enter your chat, I'm going to flip to the next slide, which is your Q focus. That is the statement that you should be reading and then asking questions about. So, your Q focus.
Lucy, a question just came in.
Yep.
In this process, how much pre-teaching do you have to do just to get them to the point where they can do the brainstorming process? Like, just writing down.
None. Yeah. This is it. It might be slow going at the beginning, but the more students do it, the faster they get.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So your Q focus is the answers you get depend on the questions you ask, by Thomas Kuhn.
And we're typing in questions?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Lucy, looks like we have one question here, and it says, who is Thomas Kuhn?
All right, so we're going to move on because I'm not sure how many people are actually coming in from a computer. So we have a number of questions that were thrown out. I'm going to read them out to you. Who is Thomas Kuhn? India shared that one with us. What kind of questions get the best information? Why does it say real simple on the top? How do I get the answers I want? How do I help my students who are stuck when asking questions? Why do my answers depend on my questions? How do I keep one student from dominating the groups? So we have engaged in, we have engaged in our divergent thinking, which means that we all are thinking about that statement in very different ways. We're starting to throw out our questions about that statement. Again, going back to that rule number 2, we're not discussing our questions, but we're throwing out these questions and we're numbering them on a chart as we make them. Okay, now we're going into a part where we're going to take our questions that are the questions that are documented and start to have some convergent thinking about narrowing down those questions into the most important questions for our group. So here's the question formulation technique steps. We were presented a question focus. We followed the rules for producing questions and we produced questions already. Typically, I would give about 5 to 7 minutes for that divergent time where we were all typing our questions in. Again, sitting in a group, one scribe would be scribing as many questions as the group could come up with in that time frame. As I said when Karen asked a question before, in the beginning, it takes a little bit longer to get your students asking questions and really kind of figuring out what this process is. As you do it more and more, pretty fast, and you can cut that time back. The one thing I always give as a disclaimer, though, is kind of you really have to read your crowd. If you cut the time too short because people haven't really gotten started or there aren't a lot of questions yet, then you kind of stop the thinking at an early point. Kids and adults through this process need to feel a little bit of uncomfortableness to feel that sort of urgency to actually come up with something and get going. And I can tell you from much experience in this that the momentum, once the momentum starts, questions will be flying out. So that's where you have to read your crowd, because you don't want to let it go too long, that many groups are sitting finished and other groups are still going, but you don't want to cut it too short. Okay.
Lucy,
the content, yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Why, is there a specific reason to have the scribe role as opposed to having kids put their own questions on stickies and putting them on a common piece of paper together?
That's certainly, I think, so a lot of the QFT as we deliver it is how that question formulation technique was originally developed and designed. But to answer your question, no, other than that's how it started. I think that we'll see, and we'll talk a little bit about a lot of the ways that people have adapted it to meet different needs. I've even seen it completed individually, so not even talking. You know, that kind of cuts out the convergent thinking with others. But some teachers have used it as a way to assess individual students by just writing down their own questions and then going through these steps.
Okay. So modifications have happened and can happen.
They absolutely have happened. And I think for ease sake, I guess, I try not to get too far into the weeds with all of the different ways you can change it. Because if you understand the framework of what it was before, then you can adapt it to meet the needs of your classroom.
Great.
Okay, so that convergent time, I usually plan for about 7 to 10 minutes. We're going to go into that next in order to categorize questions and then to work on prioritizing questions. Okay, there we go. So as you saw, there are several steps to the technique, and we touched on just a few. We're going to get into the unpacking of all of these steps and meet the founders of the Right Question Institute. So the creators of the QFT, the founders of the Right Question Institute, Dan Rothstein and Luz Santana, they believe that the skill of question formulation is the single most powerful renewable source of intellectual energy, and it is essential for all students, employees, and citizens alike. So I learned of the QFT back in 2013. I was working on a state grant around shifts in the Common Core, and these two people came to speak to our group. They had begun their work with a dropout prevention program in the Lawrence Public School District back in 1990 because parents had told them that they weren't participating in their children's education because they didn't know what to ask. So they worked with parents to teach them how to ask questions. And as many of us have done in the past, they found through their teaching that they were supporting the parents, giving the parents the questions to ask and not teaching them how to create their own questions. And so they worked to create this process in order to help those parents. What struck a chord with me, and I apologize for this graphic, it's a bit hard to read, but what struck a chord with me was statistics when I was listening to them speak. So you'll see here the percentage of basic skill attainment in reading. If you can see that, it's a sort of light blue line, and in writing, which is a dark blue line. But then they shared this. That orange line is the skill of asking questions. And they shared some information about how the average preschool child asks just shy of 100 questions a day. And that number, you can see by this graph, declines sharply right at the point that kids enter grade school. That statistic reminded me of how important it was for me to shift my instruction to student-centered and not me driving the bus all the time. And so we started practicing with the QFT. That question again about how much pre-teaching do you need to do? I literally walked out of this training and walked into my class the next day and said, okay, this is what we're doing, follow my directions. So why the question formulation technique in our classrooms? You know, teaching kids how to ask questions helps to build their problem solving skills. When we share again the website with You for the Right Question Institute, you'll see on there lots of comments and statements from 10, 15 years ago even, where college professors are stating that students are entering college not knowing how to ask questions. This process helps to support students' self-motivation and engagement. And Dan and Luz feel that these kids are the future of our democracy, and that democracy needs citizens who can ask questions and participate in decisions and hold decision makers accountable on any level. So let's walk through the question formulation technique process to unpack it. Typically, as I said, you would have students in groups. I like to have 3 or 4 sitting at a table together before I started. Sometimes I allowed kids to pick their own groups, and other times I purposely put groups together, depending on the reason that I had for using the technique at that time. Each group, I did have each group choose a scribe. It does help a little bit to move the process along. If you were to have kids write their questions on stickies and put the stickies on, that's fine. What will happen is they will spend some of their time derailing their thinking by wanting to read what other people wrote. So the idea of throwing a question out and one person writing it helps kids to hear it and to keep their thinking moving forward. But I always make sure that I stress that spelling is not important when it comes to the chart paper. You may disagree, but it helped to keep moving along. So I always start by the rules. One of the things that I do like to do more when I'm working with adults than I'm working with my students, I guess, but I do like to ask them to read the rules and think about which rule is going to be the most difficult for them today or during that time. It helps to keep that rule fresh in their mind as they're going through the process. Oftentimes with adults, it's number 2. And the other part of that is it helps the group know, today I think I'm going to have a hard time coming up with questions, and so they can encourage and push each other along. Or I really think I'm going to have a hard time not discussing the question, and so you'll hear and you'll see as soon as someone starts to talk about a question, another participant will say, oh, number 2, keep moving. After reviewing the rules, we do provide a question focus. So looking at this step process again, we today did rules before question focus. I like to do that. That's my modification, I guess, to Karen's point. I like to do the rules first because I want them to just see the statement and get started. So the question focus. The question focus is the most difficult part of the process for you, for the teacher, for the facilitator here. Creating a good Q focus really requires a lot of practice, but I can tell you from experience that you will learn from even the poor choices for Q focus that you might make. So a question focus can be a statement or a phrase. It can be a picture. It can be a simple math problem or an equation, but it should be a statement and not a question at all. The simpler is the better, although the higher you get in student level, I also add that the more controversial you can make the statement, the more engagement you will have in kids. So, the best way to work on a Q focus is to start with the end in sight. So thinking about, why am I engaging in this question formulation technique? What part of my instruction am I using? Is it the beginning of the unit, the middle of the unit, the end of the unit? Do I want kids to create a list of questions to drive instruction? Am I looking for formative assessment, summative assessment? Am I using it for them to pick something to research? So thinking about the end first, you want to define your purpose. What do you want to accomplish by the QFT? Keep your teaching goals and your learning outcomes in mind. Then generate possible ideas. Think about what students will be doing with those questions, again, that end in mind, and list all kinds of ideas in different formats, going back to that idea of, is it a visual, is it a statement? Is it a combination of both? If you keep statements as brief and as simple as possible, the better. And if you list all of those ideas down, it will help you go through the next step, which are thinking about the pros and the cons of each individual possible Q focus statement. So identifying those pros and cons for each statement is really about thinking of it from your student's perspective. What might this Q focus generate from your students? One way that I have found to be beneficial to sort of do this is to either, with older kids, grab just a couple of students to say, hey, if I gave this, what would you ask me? Sort of verbally, just to see where their line of questioning goes. Sometimes you can bring it to a department meeting or see a peer who teaches either the same grade level or a peer that might teach the same subject and ask them to kind of give you some feedback on where they think your students might go with their questioning. So imagine the direction or the directions that each Q focus statement could lead you to in order to try to narrow down to the best possible choice that you're going to try. So let's look at a couple examples here. Again, a Q focus could be an image or a picture. No words, something as simple as this. It could be also a quote from a person or a text. This was from a 6th grade unit on making a great story, and it was used for guiding questions in the unit. Good fiction creates its own reality. Nora Roberts was what the students saw. In this 12th grade example, the teacher put this quote from a book on the board, and students asked questions about it in order to bring them into the story that they were about to read. Students were given this math 3rd grade topic on subtraction algorithms. And the purpose of this Q focus was to build an understanding on how alternative algorithms work. So the students just saw what you see right now, and then they listed lots of questions about that we'll see later. It might be something like tornadoes, equation equals balance. Tornadoes is a 2nd grade example of a science topic of weather concepts, and this was used to introduce students to the content and to learn how to research and organize presented information. So students listed questions that you'll see in a minute, and those were their guiding questions for their research. This high school geometry statement, equation equals balance, was used to engage and stimulate students in a conversation to start their geometry course. We have a couple here from high school global history statements in order for students to engage in questioning. So after you provide the Q focus, you begin, as we did. Groups will ask as many questions as they can. They should be following the rules and listing those questions however you determine, but they should be numbering them in an order. That's when they produce questions. So again, they're divergent thinking, coming from lots of different perspectives, and then going into some convergent thinking next. So here are some examples of what students came up with for questions to the Q focus. So why don't they have bones? Why are some white and some brown? Do they reproduce? People always point out, do they poop? Yes, that was a question because this was a 1st grade a nonfiction literacy focus. So this is a 1st grade ELA class. Here's the one about tornadoes. It's hard for you to see the questions on the chart paper, so they're typed in here beside it. Why do tornadoes spin? Where do you see the most tornadoes and why? Why do we have tornadoes in the world? And here's your math example. So by seeing this picture, students started to ask, why is the 349 on the side? Why are there negative numbers? Why did you only add the 400 and the 50? So really getting into some questioning around the thinking here.
Lucy, I have a question.
Yes.
From the masses. Somebody's written in and they're wondering about how you make decisions about your Q focus. Is it, if you're starting, this person wants to know if you're starting out, is it better to use, the question asks what kind of Q focus is best to use, but I guess I'm wondering, do you start out with a more provocative Q focus if it's a beginner group?
So always the more provocative the Q focus is, the more engagement you'll have. But in thinking about this Q focus here in the 3rd grade, that's not very provocative, right? But it does engage in questioning. Typically, I find that when people are just starting out, it's better to dabble with the Q focus as an introduction. So an introduction to something means that kids are going to create lots of questions about what it is you plan on teaching. But sorry, did you have something else?
Nope.
Oh, okay. But it's the easiest place to answer all those questions for them because you're going into instruction. It's the easiest way to get them into the technique. And then as your students are comfortable with it, then I guess, the Q focus really depends on your purpose, your end in mind. So, if you're looking to do a summative assessment on a chapter that you've read, a comprehension assessment on a chapter that you've read, just taking out a provocative statement from that chapter could even lead you to good questions. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what to do with next steps. And so that might help answer that question also.
Okay.
Can we come back to it?
Sure.
Okay. So the next part of the process, I keep losing, would be categorizing questions. This is one place in this technique that you can extend to either subsequent lessons or take out of the process if you're trying to shorten the QFT for that day. As a 4th grade teacher in the inner city of Manchester, I was surprised, I guess, at how I had never really thought about the teaching of questions in this manner. And it brought great value to my students. This helped them to think about who they would ask when they asked questions in their life and how they would ask those questions depending on who they were approaching and what they wanted for an answer. But that in itself needs teaching outside of the question formulation technique. So I'm going to show you how you can walk through a pretty quick way of thinking about this. But that categorizing questions and the talking about when you would ask a when question or a how question does link here to this idea of open and closed. So through the QFT, remember that groups have now listed a bunch of questions that they've suggested on their own. And now you ask them to go through and list next to the question, mark a C or an O next to every question, determining whether they are closed-ended questions or open-ended questions. With 3rd and 4th graders, I found that I had to frame this as if you were asking an expert that knew the answer to the question, because sometimes they get really hung up on not having the answers themselves, which they shouldn't, and that stumps them from sort of saying, this is a closed-ended, this is an open-ended. But the idea here is to really get the students thinking about those one-word yes/no answers and which questions are going to give you a lot of information with a lot more explanation. So we ask students to go through and label C and O. Then we're going to ask them to choose one closed-ended question and rewrite it as an open-ended question. You're then going to do the opposite. Find an open-ended question and rewrite it as a closed-ended question. The students just add these to the bottom of the list and they continue to number. They add them as the next two numbers in their path. This starts the conversation about why would you answer, or why would you ask, sorry, an open-ended question? What are the advantages of open-ended? What are the disadvantages of open-ended? We got into great conversations about how some of the disadvantages might be that depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer. So if you're asking a question that you don't want three people to tell you something different, you might need to start with thinking about a closed-ended question and then build to open-ended. Some of the advantages were students found that you get lots more information. An advantage to an open-ended question is that it's probably going to lead you to another question. But we go through and do the same thing for closed-ended questions. Advantage to closed-ended, opposite of disadvantage to open, right? Closed-ended questions give me an immediate answer and I don't have to search it out. Some of the disadvantage, limited information. So that part of the process, the talking about advantages and disadvantages, really can be in subsequent lessons and can extend to a lot more about questioning words and the when and how we would use them. But after we do the categorizing, we want to move to prioritizing questions. This is really where the hard thinking happens for kids. People always ask when I talk about prioritizing questions and telling groups, okay, now you have 18 questions. I want you to pick 3. People always say, well, don't students just pick their own? And it is amazing that they don't. They need to prioritize based on what your outcome is. What are your hopes for next steps? So typically I say to students, review the list of questions and choose the 3 most important questions to your group. What are the 3 questions you absolutely want us to engage in? Depending on your reason for the QFT, it might be different. It could be choose 3 questions you feel are most important for someone else to know. Choose 3 questions you want answered. Choose 3 questions your group can't answer already. So here's another little tweak modification in the process that I started to make, and that was they haven't had a chance to talk through this whole process. Even open and closed, when they're changing from open to closed and closed to open, they're really not discussing anything. Advantages and disadvantages of the kinds of questions are not leading them to discuss the questions that they listed on their chart paper. And so here's a point at which sometimes I will say, okay, now you can discuss your questions. And if there are any that 1 student or 2 students can answer it, explain it to your friends, and cross it off your list. So they may end up with just a couple of questions the group can't already answer. So the possibilities are endless about how you prioritize, but the bottom line is that each group should come up with 2 to 3 priority questions. And then I always write my own chart paper of just those priority questions so that we have that as our classroom guide for any of the next steps that we go into. So that's where a lot of our convergent thinking happens. Then I ask groups to share. So share the questions you changed from open to closed, your 3 priority questions, where they are on your list, and why you choose those questions. The where they are on the list isn't super important for students. It's something that we do in the training because there's some data that shows that typically groups pick from certain places along their chart paper. So that's really more just to highlight that, to highlight how your thinking shifts. And a lot of the priority questions typically come out of the last third on the list. So then we're going into next steps and a reflection of the process. So one of the things that you could use your priority questions for, you could ask students to choose a priority question to focus on through instruction. And as we answer, I say to my students, as we answer that question through this unit of instruction, please highlight that. Tell me, Mrs. Kanotis, we just answered that question, and let's answer it and cross it off our list. It could be that students then pick from a priority list of which question they want to investigate. You might, as a class or small groups, investigate different questions at different times. For assessment purposes, if the priority questions are listed on the board, sometimes I would say, okay, number your paper 1 through 12, answer as many of those questions as you can, just to get a feel for where each student was within the instruction, if it was something that I threw out midway through teaching. So there's lots of options for what to do with your priority questions. And then reflection. So this is where the metacognition comes in. And although I will admit I did not do this every time I did the QFT, but it is an important part of the process. Asking students to reflect and think about either what did you learn, how did you learn it, or reflect on the process. What was hard for you today? What did your group struggle with? What was your group very successful at? What is there a misconception that you found, something that you learned today, any aha that you had, or what is something that's really still bothering you, whether it's a priority question or something that you keep thinking about. Anything that gets them to reflect on their thinking. So we've gone through the process. And I want to show you a quick video of a high school classroom engaging in this process together. Let's see if this works.
Lucy?
Yes.
Before you start that, we do have a question.
Sure.
Somebody wrote in and asked if you can give an example of how this process is embedded in a research process. Like if you were, I guess they mean if you were engaging students in a longer term research process or a project-based learning unit. Are you able to talk a little bit about that?
So typically at the elementary level, I've used it in the beginning of a research project. Many people at the secondary level will use it midway through or even really close to the end, sort of as to see if the learning that others have shared has been picked up, I guess. As an elementary teacher, I always used it at the beginning in order to frame sort of the students' research project. That allowed for students to start with something small. So going back, I'm thinking back to the tornadoes example, which wasn't mine, but thinking about tornadoes. So if I had a question, I chose one of those priority questions about tornadoes, and my focus as a student is to go in and start reading, looking for the answer to that question. Got students into the research and a little more focused, and then you could actually go through the QFT process again with the same tornadoes, or it might be a different Q focus, it might be a visual, it might be some statement about what tornadoes do to the areas they blow through. And individually, students could go through the process and write down all the questions that they have. And then what they have done in the past is if they articulate 3 priority questions, or it might allow for more, those might be the questions that drive their research and drive their book project or their research report, or if they're making a categorical informational text from the research, that might be what helps them write their 4 or 3 page book. So I think when we go, or if you go online, you'll see lots of, we're going to give you the site. You can register for free, and there's lots of resources. There's lots of examples. I think we'll have better high school examples there.
I definitely, this is not a question from, this is the comment from me. You could use this technique to explore what is a researchable question and what isn't if you're at a secondary level. I think would be very interesting.
I think you're absolutely right, Karen. And I think, you know, at the secondary level, you can have so many more conversations about all the ways to frame a question even, right? And so if you have a question and you find that it's not researchable, how do you get to a researchable question that gives you some information connected to what you're really thinking about?
Yeah. Thanks, Lucy.
Sure.
Let us know if there's supposed to be sound.
There is. Is it not working?
Nope.
Well, I can hear it. That's not helpful though, is it?
Well, that's not that.
All right. So let me take you here then. Let's do it. Let's do something different. This video here is actually, the QFT in action is actually on the site, so you could go in and see it on your own. Dan and Luz do ask people to sign up. It is free, but the more people they have signed up, the easier it is for them to convince their donors to continue to support them, rather than anyone who has an account sort of handing out the handouts and printing off those things. It's all accessible to everyone, it's all free, but best for them if people log in and sign up on their own. But you'll see there are some webinars, some videos. That video we were going to watch is right here on this site. And when you go into it, you'll see there are many more, I should say. There are many more videos. All of the links to examples are here on the side based on different disciplines. And then facilitation materials, those downloadable handouts are all right there also. Okay, so let's go back here and we'll move. Some additional resources, I will say some of these are pretty old. They're from when we started this process. The Prezi is some really good information, but it is now probably 6 or 7 years old, as is the Google Manchester site that I shared next. But down here at the bottom, this article at the Muse newspaper, it's a good article to read, but it has a great infographic, especially for secondary students. It's a great infographic connected to it about questioning, and could be a Q focus, several slides worth of different Q focus. Again, I encourage you to join for free. Sign up for an account at the Right Question Institute. You will have access to everything that you could possibly want. There are handouts with the rules that you can print off. We used to make little cards that sat on the table. There is also an organizer, I guess, for developing your Q focus statements, and some additional supporting documents for the work itself.
Lucy, how much training did you receive, and how essential, how would you feel differently had you not received the training but implemented the strategy? Do you understand what I'm getting at?
I do. So initially, before I started this, We probably had an hour, hour and a half with Dan and Liz in Concord, sort of going through what I just went through. We did have the experience of walking through the whole process because we were together in groups. So I suppose a little more training in the fact that I engaged in the process all the way through once. But since then, I guess by my own choice, I've gone to lots of different things around the QFT. But I think walking in and just trying it, I learned a lot more from just throwing it out to my class. In fact, the first Q focus I used was such a great statement in my mind, and it got kids asking fantastic questions. And when we got to the prioritizing questions, they came up with 12 or 15 priority questions, and they left for the day. And I looked at the questions and said, I can't answer any of those. So I kind of felt like it failed, but I think I learned more from just getting in and doing that. And I sort of told myself that that was how I taught my kids the steps. And we were going to move on to something else. So what
does it mean? What do you mean you couldn't answer any of those? In what way?
I'm trying to think back now, and I should have searched. I don't even know if I kept it. I should have searched for the statement that I put out there. It was this very fourth grade friendly, but very theoretical statement about learning or about education or something. And every question they came up with was not a question that I could provide an answer with. It was something that I would have had to do more research to provide the data for those answers. You know, like they weren't fourth grade answers.
Mm-hmm. But that doesn't make them, if you can't answer them, that doesn't make it a rejectable question, right? It's just
no, not at all. I think
you want to keep going with what you started. If it was, in other words, couldn't they pursue answers, even if the answers were subjective?
So the rejectable part was that I didn't have at the time, this was probably 2013, I didn't have the resources to send them to get their answers. I didn't know where they would get the answers because some of them were just such great questions. And it wasn't about content. It was more about theory and people's beliefs. I think.
Couldn't you still create the project-based unit around that?
I think, Karen, if that was an experience that I had now,
yeah,
I would have been able to figure out how to turn it into something good.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But I think, you know, I guess my point is that, and that's sort of my thinking around, like, no matter what your Q focus is and whether you feel it's successful or not, like, I learned, okay, now I know that I really need to think through and think about the outcomes as well as just throwing out this great controversial statement, or, you know, like,
right.
I didn't necessarily at the time have the capacity to turn that into something, but it was how I introduced the process, and my kids were very resilient, and we moved on to fractions.
But what we're saying is that it's good to, and you said this during the webinar, that you should brainstorm what for yourself when you're coming up with the Q focus, what some of the questions might be, so that
absolutely.
It's student centered, but it's helpful if you have an end in mind or an outcome in mind or a process in mind before you break open Pandora's box, really.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, as we talked about before this is like a fast and hard, here are all the steps and this is how it happens. You know, but typically in the training that I've done for the Right Question Institute, typically, you know, we spend an hour and a half walking through the process and unpacking it, and then an hour and a half on how to develop a good Q focus. You don't have to do 3 hours of training. You can jump in and try it. I'm also very happy to answer any questions or take a look at QFocus. If anyone's close to Plastow or Danville, I'd be happy to come and try it out with you. You know, I walk into classrooms all the time and say, all right, this is what we're doing today. And I obviously having spoken to the teacher, but, you know, putting up a QFocus and trying it out. The best way to get into this is to try it and see where your own questions are.
And I know that Dan and Luz, they offer training through Harvard, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Harvard. So there was an online training in April around this. So I know that, yeah, a lot of
I do believe there's a graduate course. I'm not exactly sure if it's a 3-credit course, but it is an online course through Harvard. They also always have a summer institute in Boston. And then there are several people around the state, excuse me, who are trained in the QFT and could easily be connected with people if they're far away from here.
And one of those people is you, Lucy, no? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And I did also want to point out, as you were speaking, and this is more for some of the schools that we're working with through the CSI initiative, lots of, or any schools, many schools have parent engagement goals. And I'm realizing now that to replicate this process as part of a parent engagement initiative might be a really interesting endeavor. So that's something to think about. Because that's like,
absolutely,
that was the origin.
And that was the origin. And there was sort of an interesting shift because it was about parent engagement. The QFT actually came to education very late in its process. So although it started with educating parents, the process of the QFT was picked up first by health, the sort of health field, where they trained technicians, they trained people training to be doctors and nurses to go into waiting rooms and to walk people through this process in order for patients to be prepared with questions to ask their doctors. It was then used quite frequently with unions. One in particular, I can't remember if it's New Mexico or Texas, but Dan and Luz worked with unions on contract issues for migrant workers. And it sort of came its way to education after lots of these other areas and professions had utilized it, because someone finally said, well, why aren't we teaching our kids how to do this? Mm. And Dan and Liz do have that book all about parent. Their second book is about supporting parents through the QFT.
Okay, well, that's really good to know. Thank you. Okay. Indy, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Hi. Do you want to?
Hello.
So I guess, so Lucy, are you, are we good to go?
We're good to go. If you want to attach this, there is a cute little video, but I won't try it because the sound probably won't work either. I don't know why. Okay. There's a cute video here about how we start as young people as questions and we end up as periods because we don't ask questions when we get old. So that's a cute video if you want to go back and watch that. Obviously, there's the link to the QFT in action, which again is a 12th grade humanities video. Online, there are 2 other videos, one elementary level and one middle school level, and all of the handouts that you could possibly desire.
Okay. Lucy, can you send me the link to that video that you just showed, that the
I will send you the PowerPoint,
video, and I can forward it to the participants.
Sure.
Okay. All right.
All right. Well, it looks like we're coming to a close here. I want to say thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Lucy, for that wealth of information. That was really informative. Thank you so much. If anyone wants to go back over this information, as Karen pointed out, and also as Lucy pointed out, just go to our website, demonstratedsuccess.com, and log into your accounts and go to our resources page. We can go ahead and open up the floor now if anyone has any questions. Anyone have any lingering questions? If you can tap in the chat and say yes or no, if you have any questions, we can proceed.
Don't see any questions.
Okay. All right. Well, once again, thank you for coming to Teaching Students to Ask Questions webinar, and we'll go ahead and close this out.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And have a great day. And yep, if you want to contact us, you can email me if you have any trouble getting to the recording. And you can email Lucy or me if you want to move ahead with any PD or you want any more information. Okay, take care, everybody.